This is the Vivo iQOO Neo3 5G, the world's cheapest Snapdragon 865 powered smartphone with a 144Hz display at just $379. It is ridiculous how you get such value for money in a flagship. The box is pretty similar to the iQOO style over here. We get a transparent rubbery case in the box here, which is not much I'd write home about, but nevertheless you get it. We have a USB Type A to Type C cord over here for USB 2.0 transfer speeds, and we have a wonderful 44-watt charger in the block. This is stepped down from the iQOO 3's 55-watt, but the battery is slightly bigger. This is the dark night, as they call it here in China, version of the phone. You also get a sky blue version, but I really love how this kind of moon shimmery light goes from blue into black. It really is a dark night if you ask me. It looks absolutely stunning, very chrome. So if you guys don't like reflections on phones, I suggest grabbing something more matte-like. We have that camera bump at the top there, which is not too big, which we'll get to in a second. The blue at the bottom really shines through and looks absolutely incredible. It also color codes with the sides of the phone too. As opposed to the Black Shark 3 Pro, it is a lot smaller and a lot lighter. 253 grams for the Black Shark as opposed to the Neo's 198 grams. The RedMagic 5G, very similar, 218 grams here, very similar in size to the Neo, but the Neo is once again lighter in weight. When you look at them at the back, the iQOO Neo3 looks the most not so distinguished as a gaming phone, more so subtle like these other two flagship phones, which are not gaming phones. Like I said earlier with the camera bump, it is very small, but on gaming phones you usually get small camera bumps, as you can see there with the Black Shark 3 Pro. And moving on to the RedMagic, it is actually slightly bigger than that one, though we get a wonderful triple camera setup, which we'll get to in a bit. The Mi 10 Pro besides it over here has a much bigger camera bump, but that is a camera centric phone. Once we slap on that CPU case over here, things don't look the greatest, but if you do take it off, bear in mind that you're going to get a lot of fingerprint marks. This thing is a fingerprint magnet, though at least we have some glass at the back. We have a fingerprint sensor powered with the power button over there and a non-split volume rocker on the right hand side. At the top we have an indent over there, which is nice. We have a dual SIM tray over here, but unfortunately there is no space for a micro SD, so we're just going to have to stick with a 128 gig version if you do get that model. We have USB 2.0 transfer speeds at the bottom, 4500 mAh battery with 44-watt charging, which is great. We do have dual stereo speakers. We will do a speaker test later on. Unfortunately there is no Dolby Atmos, but they do have different sound profiles for gaming and movies, etc. The Black Shark 3 Pro has pop-up triggers and LED effects. The RedMagic 5G also has LED effects and it has triggers there. The iQOO Neo 3 has no LED effects and no triggers of any kind. It is pretty much a subpar gaming phone if you ask me, with all those wonderful capabilities inside. We're going to be doing a gaming test very soon, but let's focus on the screen for now. We have a 6.57-inch IPS LCD screen with a 20:9 aspect ratio, Full HD Plus with P3 color, HDR10, and a wonderful 144Hz refresh rate panel. That IPS display doesn't look too bad, even close up. At angles, it's actually surprisingly good. If we take a look at the other two gaming phones here, the Black Shark 3 and the RedMagic 5G with AMOLED panels, you can see that they are quite a bit brighter and they don't look as dull, though we do have an option on the Neo 3, which I'll get to in a minute, where you can actually make the white balance look slightly better and cooler. If you look at bezels, the bottom bezel is pretty chunky, though the rest of the bezels are pretty slim. If you look at another flagship here, one of the cheapest ones, the Realme X50 Pro, it is still more expensive than the Neo 3 and only has a 90Hz refresh rate panel, though it does have an AMOLED panel. So with the Neo 3 here, we can actually make it cooler on the panel using the color settings within the settings, and it doesn't look too bad if you ask me, if that is your cup of tea. We have a 90Hz panel on the Black Shark 3. We have 144, 120, 90 and 60 and smart switch on the Neo 3, which is a first. I've never seen so many refresh rate options in a phone. We're going to slow down a speed over here when scrolling through apps over here, and as you guys can see, the 144Hz is so much quicker. You see so much on the screen per second over here, frames per second, as opposed to the 60 all the way on the left hand side. It's nice that Vivo iQOO have actually allowed you to fluctuate between the hertz of the panels. Now, many people have said that IPS 144Hz is different to AMOLED, so we're going to do a test here against the RedMagic 5G. As you can see, things are actually really similar. I don't see much of a difference here at all. Of course, when you're gaming, you might see a little bit of a difference because of the brightness, but we'll get to a gaming test right now. As you guys can see, unlike other phones around where they say they have a high refresh rate panel, but unfortunately, we do not have the option for high refresh rate gaming. This one is not that case. We have a full 144 Hertz there. We do have super audio over here set to smart. Let's give it a listen. Now we're moving on to Bullet Force over here, maximum settings, no FPS cap. As you guys can see, we're getting over 120 frames per second, which is absolutely stunning. And those dual audio speakers sound absolutely superb. Just listen to this. We also have a bunch of different options using the ultra game mode space over there, and we'll get to that in a second. For now, let's focus back on software. We do have dark mode, even though it is an LCD panel. I'm glad that they have introduced it here once more. It works great with first-party apps over here, and comparing it to an AMOLED dark panel, it doesn't look too different there, though it's not going to help your battery the way an AMOLED does help your battery with a black screen over there. The software is pretty standard now. It's actually getting a lot more stock than it has been on previous Monster UI phones. It's looking a lot more standard as opposed to other gaming phones out there. It is not gaming centric when you are moving around the phone, which is nice if you are not a fully fledged gamer. We also have Monster mode as a high performance mode, which is great. We'll enable that later when we get to our AnTuTu test, and it gives us pretty much an X mode Asus kind of style there when we turn it on with reference to the icons. Talking about the icons, we can actually round them and square them off and make them smaller and bigger, which is nice. We get some customization options there. We also have standard and draw mode, which is pretty cool. I'm glad to see that draw mode is still in the works for Vivo. And we also have that wonderful fingerprint sensor, though it is a physical one and not underneath the screen because this is not an AMOLED panel. It works surprisingly well and very snappy. The X50 Pro on my left hand side here is pretty much the fastest around, and it keeps draws with that. No harm at all there. When it comes to facial recognition, it is as quick as the X50 Pro, if not even quicker. That front lens can also be used to take some selfie snaps, 16 megapixel f2.0 lens. And when we do look at the snaps here, things are really crisp and clear using that 16 megapixel selfie cam. Shoot over to portrait. It doesn't look too blurry, but very clear. Let's listen to some audio and video.
What's up guys, this is TechNick recording a 1080p 30 frames per second selfie video on the Vivo iQOO Neo3. It is completely capped at 30 frames per second and at 1080p resolution. Let me know what you guys think of the audio and video quality using the video selfie cam on the iQOO Neo3.
On the back of the iQOO Neo3, we have a 48 megapixel IMX582 sensor. This is pretty much an IMX586 sensor without 4K 60 frames per second. 8 megapixel ultra wide lens here, 2 megapixel macro sensor. Of course, 4K is limited to 30 frames per second, but we do still have 1080p at 60 frames per second. Unfortunately, no 8K video is present or optical image stabilization here. 8 megapixel ultra wide looks pretty stunning here with AI turned on. Going to that 48 megapixel raw shot over here, things look pretty dull. As soon as we hit into a 300% crop there, you can see that for sure. Going back to that 48 megapixel main still to compare it with the 12 megapixel bin shots. A bind is when we take 4 pixels into one for a greater binned pixel over there. And things don't look too bad with 2x digital. Of course, we lack a telephoto lens. The big brother iQOO 3 doesn't have that wonderful Hertz panel, but it does have a telephoto lens over there. This lacks that, so zooming in doesn't look too great. Portrait mode over here looks pretty decent, I must say. And shooting back to that bin pic and moving on to that wonderful 2 megapixel macro, it picks up a lot of detail close up, which is always a nice extra bonus. 1080p at 60 frames per second looks pretty good, but it is very wonky with no optical image stabilization here whatsoever. 4K 30 frames per second also quite wonky, looks slightly more stable because we are just shooting at 30 frames per second here. The IMX582, as I mentioned before, has a cap of 30 frames per second and 4K. 1080p 30 frames per second ultra wide. This is the max for ultra wide. No 4K here and no 60 frames per second. Bit of a bummer, slightly stable. There is no stabilization mode option on this phone, but it is not the worst I have seen. Black Shark 3 Pro on my left hand side, RedMagic 5 on my right hand side, and the iQOO Neo3 in the middle over here. All of them are going to be shooting onto an AnTuTu version 8.3.4 over here to test out the performance of these three devices. Now bear in mind that this is not all about performance running a benchmark score, but it is always nice to see some numbers over here during an unboxing test. The Black Shark unfortunately cannot run AnTuTu through Sharkspace, very strange there, but we can do it with GameSpace on the RedMagic 5G over here and turn on super game performance mode. We have the battery percentages and degrees in Celsius at the start, as well as the CPU degrees in Celsius at the start here as well. We'll compare it at the end. I'm just going to speed through this AnTuTu test. I'll get into a more detailed one in the coming week, so stay tuned for that. But as for now, we just want to check out the degrees in Celsius and the final score. We got the worst battery drain on the iQOO Neo3 and RedMagic 5G, but they do have the smallest batteries here. The iQOO Neo3 was the hottest here, but the RedMagic 5G actually added the most amount of heat in degrees Celsius in the battery department, with the Black Shark 3 Pro being the coolest all around. When it comes to CPU, it can be very similarly said here. The iQOO Neo3 added the least amount of degrees Celsius. The Black Shark 3 Pro was the hottest and added the most in degrees Celsius. First place, the iQOO Neo3, very impressive here, 596,000 points as opposed to the 594 on the RedMagic and 577 on the Black Shark 3 Pro. We got the best memory on the iQOO Neo3, but the best CPU, GPU, and user experience on the RedMagic 5G, and the second best GPU and memory on the Black Shark 3 Pro. The Vivo iQOO Neo3 is one stunning device for its price point. 144 Hz mayhem is absolutely amazing for just 380 bucks. It looks visually stunning from all angles and doesn't look like much of a gaming phone, but as soon as you open up that ledge in the phone, it does some phenomenal work. I have a 3.5mm headphone jack, and if you can get off your high horse about it being an LCD IPS screen over here, then it is one seriously good buy. Of course, we have all these different refresh rate options here, which I have never seen before. 144 Hz being the talking point over there. There are other gaming phones out there, but they are a lot more expensive, and there are other phones out there as well, budget-friendly phones, but this is still the cheapest Snapdragon 865 powered phone around. In my opinion, this is the best budget phone of 2020 so far, and I'd almost always pick the Vivo iQOO Neo3 over any other flagship killer around. Guys, this is TechNick, and I'll see you in the next one.